What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some of my favorite DLC expansions. Add-ons to existing games that, hopefully make them better in general. Expansions can do a lot of things for a title, whether that be a sort of redemption arc in some cases, simply expanding what's on offer, fixing the annoyances of the base game experience as well, and, many other things. But as it just so happens, I have spent most of June, with today being July 1st, by the way, having played through and reviewed a bunch of DLCs, as I had to get caught up on all of them after I had seen many of them released, and in so doing, it had occurred to me that I hadn't actually talked about expansions in quite some time. And so I looked it up, and the exact last time was in January of 2024. And we've gotten some great expansions since then, that obviously I want to talk about. Now what's really interesting though is that I actually had an opportunity to replay a few of my favorite old ones in the form of recent remasters, and then there's also probably going to be the opportunity to do that again here in July with Neverwinter Nights 2, which is all to really just say it's kind of a busy time for DLC, surprisingly. But before we dive fully into this, just a quick note, none of these are in any particular order. I wasn't trying to rank these are just my favorites in general. I don't really feel like giving it the thought required to properly rank them if I'm being completely honest, but these are definitely my favorites across the board. But that said, something has to go first here, and so we are going to kick it off with Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader. Having just recently reviewed its Lex Imperialis DLC, I was reminded then of just how much I enjoyed Void Shadows, its prior DLC. Its debut DLC, if you will. And while I enjoyed Lex Imperialis, one thing I noted in my review for that is that it just wasn't quite as good as Void Shadows if you want to compare something with similar content in the same game, of course. I would go so far as to say that Void Shadows is honestly Owlcat's best DLC that I've experienced, and a lot of that comes down to both the subject matter but also the way it's presented. Void Shadows has to do with gene stealers infiltrating your ship and causing all sorts of problems, which leads to the exact problems you would expect if you know what gene stealers are, which is to say, imposters seeking to establish a cult and take over. And it's a really insidious threat that Void Shadow does incredibly well at portraying. In fact, that's probably my favorite thing about this DLC specifically, is just how good of a job they do of presenting such an iconic threat for that particular universe. And the crazy part is, as enjoyable as that experience is, that's not even all of it. The DLC also added new ways to play the game with various archetypes or classes if you prefer. They also added on to that content with Imperial Death Cults, and the framing of that DLC and the new companion Cabela was really cool. And as such, for me at least, it was a really compelling experience, which is obviously why I wanted to add it to this particular list. But we are far from done, because next up we've got Cyberpunk 2077's Phantom Liberty DLC. So this particular DLC kind of cemented the redemption arc that Cyberpunk 2077 enjoyed after its notoriously rough launch. They put in a bunch of work via patches and stuff that slowly made the game better, and the capstone to that process was the release of the Phantom Liberty DLC, which even went further and overhauled some things, and turned it into a really compelling experience. Now, on my end at least, I had actually covered all of the Cyberpunk 2077 updates along the way, just for the people who are unaware. I actually reviewed Cyberpunk when it launched, which was before I'd actually started doing YouTube full-time. Followed it for several years until the release of Phantom Liberty in 2023, of course, and so I got to see that entire process, play through basically every patch of that process as a matter of fact. And one thing I really enjoyed about Phantom Liberty was admittedly that sort of side story about how it really did sort of mark the entire process they underwent in correcting that colossal launch mistake. They committed an enormous amount of money to fixing it, and they managed it. But truth be told, that says very little about the DLC itself in terms of content. And in that regard, Phantom Liberty is a spy thriller, basically putting you right smack in the middle of an espionage mission involving the new USA and the back and forth between the actual government and these incredibly powerful corporations that have all but taken over. And that part was actually what I enjoyed most about the DLC, because obviously the corporations and the dystopia of it all takes precedence in Night City, but having a DLC actually zoom out a little bit and show directly how the actual government that is supposed to be there is interacting with all these corporations and the position and the political back and forth of those things was especially interesting to me. Add on top of that some fantastic characters, an entirely new area to explore, and definitely some of the game's better missions, and I think it's no surprise at all that this particular DLC landed so well on top of all the changes they had made to the core systems. Keeping it moving though, as we are far from done, what would a DLC list be without a mention of the Shivering Isles from the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion? So this is an interesting one in the sense that it's been one of people's favorites for a very long time, and yet this year actually saw the release of Oblivion Remastered, which means you can of course experience the magic of the Shivering Isles all over again in much higher fidelity. And speaking on that specifically, I remember as a teenager the entrance to the Shivering Isles sort of exploding into butterflies, and it's one of those situations where my memory of what that scene looks like was so much more than the reality of it. And yet, even then, I gotta admit, it really kind of gave me the warm and fuzzies getting to see that exact moment again going into this DLC, but that's really not the reason I actually like it. So my favorite thing about the Shivering Isles is actually what it does for the game's mechanics, and what I mean by that is specifically the game's Radiant AI system. Oblivion is a game that's often known for being goofy, that people often refer to as, its sort of unique charm. But the catch there is that Radiant AI system really just causes NPCs to do a lot of weird, odd stuff a lot of the time. But you take that as a system and then throw it into the Shivering Isles, the home of the Mad God, and suddenly you've provided a narrative context to what the game was already doing. You've taken all these weird and odd behaviors NPCs would get up to, and you've worked it fully into the narrative and actually wrote around it as a mechanic, which means suddenly both the game's actual moment to moment in terms of how NPCs are interacting and everything match up perfectly with this story that's being told about all of these people you meet being inflicted by the Mad God's blessing. And for me at least, it really does just work at that point. But this one is obviously one people have talked to death, so I'll keep it moving a little bit. People often hear me talk about Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, but it just so happens that not only do I enjoy Deadfire for what it is, it also actually has one of my favorite DLCs, that being the Beast of Winter. Now the reason I enjoy Beast of Winter so much is that it's basically like someone asked me specifically what I would have enjoyed a DLC about. You see, Beast of Winter centers around the god Rimmergand, the god of entropy and oblivion. He doesn't get a lot of screen time during the base game, just a few things here and there, but the thing is, he's my favorite deity from that universe. And so getting to see his lore and stuff expanded in a full-on expansion that also brings in great characters like his ending's godlike Vatnir, which it's very confusing as to why he even made him to begin with, opens up some really interesting questions. And then that's before you actually dive into the sort of alternate reality that sees you experiencing some of the more central events of the timeline and universe, which I used to do whole lore series about, so I clearly enjoyed, firsthand via this DLC. So I mostly like Beast of Winter because, again, it's like somebody handmade it for me specifically, even if I don't think it's necessarily everybody's favorite by far. Swinging it back around to Owlcat Games, though, everybody also knows that Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is in fact my favorite game, so probably unsurprisingly, it's also home to one of my favorite DLCs. Now, what may actually be surprising is that the favorite DLC I have with this game is actually one of the least popular ones, which is Through the Ashes. You see, the first act of Wrath of the Righteous is about you taking the city of Canabras back from the demons who have infested it, dealing them a surprise blow, which then goes on to inspire the Fifth Crusade, which are the events of the main campaign. But Through the Ashes is actually a sort of side story DLC that puts you in the role of everyday people during that invasion, just trying to get to the safety of the inn where everyone is rallying their forces at, the Defender's Heart. Now, a lot of people don't like this DLC, or I should at least say it has mixed reviews, and this is because this DLC puts you on the back foot. You are in a perilous position. You have weaker characters, weaker equipment, Sometimes you literally take penalties from it, and you have to balance all of those things against the actual very serious threats that the demons pose. And as a result of that, it's a DLC where you are very much so not exactly the hero, but rather you are just trying to survive. And given the very grand nature of the main campaign, it didn't sit right with everybody, but I found just the experience of trying to get these people to safety in the middle of this demonic invasion to be a really compelling thread narratively, but having to put my knowledge of all these classes and things to find a sort of best solution, or at least a most fun solution, perhaps would be a better way to put it, across that adventure, trying to make sure I maximize every advantage I can because they are few and far between, was just a lot of fun for me personally. It is my favorite of those DLCs by far, but there were some other good ones as well. We've still got 5 more DLCs to talk about, however, so let's keep it moving. Coming in at number 5, though again these are in no particular order, one that was bound to be on this list as well, which is of course The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine. One of those DLCs that's honestly big enough to be its own standalone game realistically. It's like 30-40 hours easily. At least the first time you run through it. You can definitely do it in less. But I love this for a lot of the same reasons many other people do. The story is great. In fact, I would say as far as the base game goes, the only story that is outright, I think, better than this one narratively is the stuff with the Bloody Baron. But this particular story is also very good. I love the ins and outs and how different things can play out. The fact that Geralt has to, of course, navigate people actively trying to take advantage of him and lying to your face. And you, as the player, of course, either choosing to go along with that or not before it either blows up in your face or doesn't, which leads to all the different endings which you get to see play out and have real effects on the things around you. And that's before we even get into how the DLC becomes a bit of a narrative closure for the game. Now, that specific thing right there, the fact that this was supposed to be a bit of a goodbye to the fans here for the incredible success of this game. In fact, from what I understand, it's actually creeping up on Skyrim's total copies sold sales record. It might have actually passed it relatively recently, but it's certainly on track to. Nonetheless, though, there have been rumors floating around that The Witcher 3 might get another story DLC ahead of The Witcher 4, which I suppose isn't impossible. I just feel like it'd be a little weird and unnecessary. Like, I'm obviously not averse to more The Witcher 3, but it's just, again, just not necessary at all. Especially, though, because of just how well Blood and Wine wraps up everything going on with this game. I think it was just such a perfect bit of narrative closure to this, and the choices you made throughout the journey, that it is really just not something that needs to be altered at this point, but we'll see what happens. Another great DLC, though, just so happens to be Mask of the Betrayer. Another, at least in my eyes, sort of redemption-type DLC for Neverwinter Nights 2. So, Mask of the Betrayer did 2 things really, really well, which is, one, it told an incredibly cool story, getting deep into some really interesting lore, but also it went a long way to sort of rectifying Neverwinter Nights 2's really underwhelming ending. I'm not going to spoil what exactly goes wrong there, just because the Neverwinter Nights 2 Enhanced Edition is actually coming out here in like 2 weeks from the time of this video. But the base game ending was very underwhelming, and Mask of the Betrayer picks up after that and tells this really, really interesting story around an unending hunger that gets strapped to you while you're also dealing with all sorts of other fun bits of lore. For instance, meeting some of the Red Wizards of Thay, or exploring the astral plane, meeting Kelemvor, having a chat with a dead god, and many other things. It's just a really cool DLC that is a much more satisfying conclusion to the story of your character in that game than the original game was. Which is obviously why it's on the list. But with 3 more to go, I next up want to talk a little bit about Fallout 4's Far Harbor, which is an interesting one, because if you watch the channel much, I enjoy Fallout. I like it a lot, I'm happy to play the Fallout games, and I almost always have a lot of fun with them. And yet, I would not consider myself at any point a sort of die-hard fan of the entire franchise the way a lot of people are. In fact, I would say, if anything, Elder Scrolls is more of that kind of thing for me, at least as far as the eternal Fallout versus Elder Scrolls debate is going these days. But when it comes to Fallout 4 specifically, I often tell people that, for me at least, it's a game of high highs and low lows. There's stuff I really, really enjoy about it, and there's parts of it that are just really bad, honestly. Except when you get to Far Harbor, where it's mostly just really, really good stuff. It's much more interesting, I think, narratively, especially, who you side with, which factions of this island do you want to believe, who do you think is morally correct in this situation, which can lead to all sorts of different outcomes. Some of the best enemy design in that entire game. The first time I saw one of those hermit crabs, it freaked me out. And you've got an experience that, for me at least, was just heads and tails above the base game. And realistically, I think the only part of this DLC I just outright wasn't really a fan of were those weird data missions, which is hardly an uncommon sentiment. Many people don't like those, as they feel like there's something from a different game, almost. But everything else about Far Harbor was just incredibly cool, which made it much easier, frankly, to be substantially more engaged with the story being told as part of that DLC than it was even the main story. So no small wonder then that it's one of my favorites. Bringing us to the last two, however, we then have Lord of Destruction. So Lord of Destruction was a big expansion for Diablo 2. Now, Lord of Destruction is a really interesting expansion because its changes were so wide and sweeping to the game that it's just kind of become intrinsic to the overall experience. In fact, when you hear people talk about Diablo 2, they're pretty much guaranteed to be referring to, of course, the Lord of Destruction version, which brought Act 5, the final fight with Bhaal, and probably most notably, the entire Runewords system. Probably one of the biggest systems Diablo 2 is remembered for was added purely with that expansion. It also brought things like jewels and charms, and somehow though, despite as huge as those were, probably honestly not even the biggest change, as this particular DLC also added the druids and the assassins to the game, which were not in there previously, and considering that my personal favorite class for Diablo 2 has always been the druid, it was huge for me. So, Lord of Destruction just overhauled that game in a big, big way. To the point where even all these years later with something like Diablo 2 Resurrected, most of my favorite stuff from Diablo 2 came from that expansion. It really is wild just how much it added and expanded on. But that does bring us to our final entry, which is none other than Throne of Bhaal for Baldur's Gate 2. So, as somebody who has covered the entirety of the Baldur's Gate trilogy, including the original 2 CRPGs, in fact, chances are you may have watched my supercuts of the story of the first two, or my beginner's guide for jumping into Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, which are videos that have been kind of evergreen for me. They did extremely well, especially in the lead-up to, of course, the release of Baldur's Gate 3. In fact, my supercut for the story of the first game was, I believe, the 8th most watched video on my channel currently. And my new player's guide for Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 was actually the 11th most watched video on the channel. So I've played those games a lot, I suppose is what I'm getting at. And the story of both Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 is this really grand narrative arc that kind of brings you from the start of a campaign to the finish of one. And you go from Gorian's ward to the person choosing what to do with this sort of unexpected divinity that has been thrust upon you via the Throne of Bhaal expansion. After the second game ends, Throne of Bhaal picks up right after that, and it finally gets to the crux of the situation. There are only so many Bhaal spawn left, and we have to decide who has earned the right to be here, frankly, which, obviously is going to be our character. But much in the way that I'm using Throne of Bhaal to bring it into this video, the reason I enjoy this DLC so much is really just how good it is at wrapping things up. It really just brings so much closure to that entire story arc by just finishing up the little threads you've seen along the way, bringing in a really interesting villain that has done things a little differently than you to get to that point. And while that is some decent content, really it's just best quality that was kind of overwhelming for me, was just, again, putting such a fantastic bow on a great experience. Because while the story begins with you, Gorian's ward, being thrust into a conflict you don't understand, with no idea about who you really are, over the course of that adventure you've gained power, fought against impossible odds, overcome every challenge, swept the battlefield of all the other upstarts, and your reward for that is being granted the freedom to actually make a choice to, for good or ill, embrace or cast off the divine heritage that haunts your blood. It's an epic conclusion to an epic tale, and I love it a lot. And that is probably as fitting a place as any to wrap up this particular video, so I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.